Today we're going to look into your first unit, the Intro to Psychology, where we're going to kind of find out some of the basic information that's going to set the stage for the rest of our units. To begin with, those are your essential statements for this unit. So the things that we're going to cover, we'll cover the goals and scientific basis of psychology. We'll look into the scientific method, the different types of research method, ethical issues that we have in research, and then also the problems and possible solutions in research. So to begin with, what is psychology? Okay, psychology is simply just a study of behavior in animals and humans, and just the process of them thinking as well. We also look into how do people think, feel, and what do they do, which ties into our goals. Okay, in psychology, there's really four main goals that they use the scientific method to try to achieve. The first is to describe, and when we're talking about describing, we're talking about gathering information about behavior and the facts and trying to describe the behavior that is currently happening. They also try to explain behavior, meaning they try to explain why do people behave the way they do. And by doing so, you're trying to create a hypothesis or an educated guess as to what could they potentially do as well. And that leads into your predict. Okay, by making your hypothesis, you're going to eventually try to predict how you think people or animals will behave in certain situations. And finally, we see them try to influence. This is where you start to see your psychologists dealing with people who talk to other people and try to influence their behavior in helpful ways. So you have your clinical psychologists, your counseling psychologists, and so forth. Okay, our next essential statement is dealing with the scientific method. So the process that psychologists go through to determine the behaviors of people. So first they ask a question. Okay, what do you want to find out? Okay, what is maybe occurring that you're trying to look a little bit more into? So for example, does watching violence on TV lead to aggressive behavior? Okay, do some background research as well. Okay. By doing so, you're going to be able to kind of have an understanding of what does the research say regarding my topic. Is there a correlation between the two? Is there a relationship, whether positive or negative? Okay, construct your hypothesis. And like we said, that's your educated guess. What do you think the results will be? Okay, so maybe in this situation, you guess that people who watch violent TV programs will engage in more acts of violence than people who don't. Okay, determine your variables. And when we're talking your variables, we're talking about both independent and dependent variables. So your independent variables are kind of like, what are you trying to test? What are you trying to find out? So in this situation, people who watch violent TV programs. Okay, and your dependent variable is what are the results going to be that you are testing. So in this case, people engage in aggressive acts. Then test with an experiment. Okay, test your hypothesis. Most cases you have an experimental group and you have your control group, and that way by doing so you'll be able to measure your dependent variable of both groups and figure out if your hypothesis is correct. Analyze your data and draw conclusions. Okay, so based off of your experiment, what do the results show? Is your hypothesis correct? Okay, so in our case, based off our data, is it correct to say that more people who watch TV programs are more likely to engage in violent acts or not? And finally, the biggest one is communicate. Okay, once you've done your experiment, once you figure out your data, communicate your results, share your results, and can they be replicated? Okay, a good experiment should be able to be repeated and the same results should come out. Next, we're going to take a look into research methods, so the different ways that psychologists do their experiments or try to find out the behaviors that people will do. Okay, to begin with, first you select your sample group, and this is a small group of people that represent the total population. Okay, there is no way that you could do an experiment to test the entire student body of Algona High. It's just not possible. So instead, you pick your sample group. So for example, it says instead of interviewing all juniors, you would take a sample and interview 30% of the juniors. So it's a good sampling of the student body of the junior class. Okay. After doing so, then you can look into your different methods of research. Okay. Depending on what you want to achieve, you might do one over the other. So those are your examples. So a naturalistic observation, a case study, a survey, a longitudinal study, a cross-sectional study, correlation and explanations, and finally your experiments. So to begin with, the first one is your observation. And with your observation, you are observing animals or humans in their natural setting without them knowing. So this is where you see people who watch, or you watch people at lunch. You are observing their behavior and they don't know that you are. That way you can get an accurate account of what their behavior actually is, and they're not kind of putting on a show for what you're doing. Next, you see a case study. Okay, and with the case studies, you're going to follow an individual or a small group of people, and you're going to really look into their personal lives. You're going to read their diaries. You're going to conduct a lot of interviews, do some tests, experiments, to better understand maybe the mental issues that they are currently going through. This is where you start to see a lot of psychologists who have patients who have a lot of mental issues. They will kind of do case studies of them and look into the long-term observations of those individuals. Okay, next, the easiest one is your survey. So an individual is asked a question: do you climb trees? Okay, and by doing so, you can kind of get a general idea of a large population's viewpoint on an issue, or maybe set the stage for eventually your hypothesis and maybe looking into doing an observation. Next, your longitudinal studies. Okay, you're going to study the same group of people at regular intervals over long periods of time. Okay, so the example that says on here, you're going to follow 133 infants as they grow into adulthood to determine that individuals are born with different temperaments. So from the day they're born to when they reach adulthood, you are going to check in on them regularly and observe their behavior and see if you can kind of determine that everybody was born with different temperaments. Next, we have your cross-sectional study. Okay, this is when you're going to organize individuals into groups based on age. So maybe we have 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and 7-year-olds. And then you're going to randomly sample those individuals, whether that's surveying them, testing them, or just observing their behavior. So for example, you're going to show an image to 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and 7-year-olds, and you're going to get their response. And by doing so, you can determine maybe the differences in moral development in 3-year-olds all the way to 7-year-olds without actually following one individual. This way you can get your answer earlier. Okay, next we see your correlation and your explanation. So you look at the relationship between two sets of observations and you try to determine, are they related? Is there a positive correlation? Is there a negative correlation? Or is there no correlation at all? So for example, a positive correlation would be your final grade in psychology with the hours you spent studying. So if you take a look at the scatter plot, those individuals that spent more hours studying generally had a better final grade in psychology. So that right there, that's your positive correlation. A negative correlation is where you're going to start to see, obviously, a negative effect. So your final grade in psychology versus the days absent. So you can see those that were absent more had a lower grade than those that were here every day or only missed 1 or 2 days. Next, your no correlation. There is absolutely no connection between the two things that you observe. So your final grade in psychology and your minutes brushing your teeth, the results are everywhere, so you can kind of determine there is really no connection between the two. Next, we get into experiments. Okay, this is the one that we conducted in class and probably the one that is most widely used among psychologists. So you're putting people, or in some cases animals, into a controlled situation, controlling their variables, and seeing how they react. Okay? The last things we're going to look at are ethical issues and problems in research. When we're talking ethical issues, we're talking certain standards that must be followed when conducting research on either human or animal participants. Take a look at the list. If we go through it, we're talking about like the welfare and confidentiality of all participants must be kept. Obey all state and federal laws and regulations. Respect the rights of those that are participating, as well as researchers have certain responsibilities while conducting the research. And you must have signed informed consent before all participants can participate. Problems that we see in research, the biggest one is the self-fulfilling prophecy, meaning that you were kind of told an unexpected behavior and you actually carry out that behavior without really knowing it. So an example would be if you give certain participants a sugar pill and some participants an actual pill, and the side effect of that pill is that they'll have stomach aches and headaches, and if you tell the sugar pill people that they could potentially have these side effects, they will, without really knowing, show signs of those side effects, even though all you gave them was a sugar pill. Here is a little story that you can read about, Was She Doomed? And it kind of gives you an example of the self-fulfilling prophecy, where she was told that she was going to die before her 23rd birthday, and as her birthday approached, she started getting very scared and eventually went to the hospital, had extreme hyperventilation and anxiety, and eventually died from that. We can also try to guide the behavior of individuals by raising our eyebrows or nodding our head, so looking for certain answers or approving certain behaviors. You can do so by doing those two examples. Solutions in research. How do we get away from that self-fulfilling prophecy? Usually you can do it one of two ways. You can either do a single blind experiment where the researchers know who was given, let's say, the placebo, so like the sugar pill, and who was actually given the pill that could cause side effects. The participants, however, in that situation don't know. The other is a double blind, meaning that the participants and those that are doing the experiment have no idea who was given the sugar pill and who was actually given the pill that they were testing. And we see in Milgram's experiment that this was a single blind experiment, meaning the participants did not know that they were going through this experiment to test if they would follow the authority of the researcher.